Story 1. It was a cold October night, and the hospital was nearly empty. The pediatric ward had been closed for years, but it was still part of my patrol route. I was in the monitoring room, watching the cameras, when something strange happened. On the screen of camera 12, which covered the pediatric ward hallway, I saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was a child, facing away from the camera, wearing striped pajamas. My heart started racing. No one should be there. The ward had been deactivated for years. I grabbed my radio and called the other security guard, Mike. Mike, are you seeing this? Camera 12, there's someone in the pediatric hallway. He responded, Carl, cut it out. You know there's no one there. It's probably just a glitch in the camera. But I wasn't convinced. I decided to go check it out. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way toward the pediatric ward. The hallway was dark, with only the faint light from the windows illuminating the path. The silence was so heavy that I could hear my own heartbeat. When I reached the end of the hallway, there was no one there. I sighed in relief, thinking Mike was right. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a low sound. It was like someone was crying. The sound was coming from one of the nearby rooms. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. It was an old examination room with rusty equipment and furniture covered in sheets. In the corner, I saw a small figure crouched down. It was the same child I had seen on the camera. They were crying, their face buried in their knees. Hey, are you okay? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The child stopped crying and slowly lifted their head. When they looked at me, my blood ran cold. Their eyes were completely black and their face was pale, almost translucent. Before I could react, she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin. Then she simply vanished. I ran back to the monitoring room, shaking. When I got there, Mike was staring at the screens, his face pale. Carl, did you see that? He asked, pointing at the screen. On camera 12, the child was there again, but this time, she was looking directly at the camera, with that same eerie smile. That night, I learned the hospital had a dark past. Years ago, a child had died in that ward under mysterious circumstances. They say she never left. After that, I was never the same. Even now, whenever I hear the sound of crying, I remember that night at the hospital, and I know that some things should never be disturbed. Story 2. It was a night unlike any other in Blackwood, a small town in the interior of the United States. The sky was heavy with dark clouds and the rain poured down in torrents, as if the sky itself were weeping. The wind howled through the trees, making the twisted branches look like skeletal hands reaching for something or someone. I was the night watchman at the Blackwood Cemetery, a job I took out of necessity, but that quickly turned into a nightmare. The cemetery was old, with tombstones worn down by time and abandoned mausoleums that seemed to whisper dark secrets when the wind passed through them. That night, I was alone, as always, but something was different. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the very environment was watching me. My cabin was small and dimly lit, with only a single light flickering erratically. I tried to focus on a book to distract my mind, but the sounds of the storm outside were impossible to ignore. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the cemetery, followed by an unsettling silence. The rain stopped for a moment, as if the world itself were holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy across the soaked ground. My heart pounded, and I slowly got up, grabbing my flashlight. I knew I had to investigate. It was my job, after all, but every fiber of my being screamed for me to stay where I was. As I stepped out of the cabin, my flashlight illuminated the path ahead. The rain started falling again, but now it felt colder, sharper. The dragging sound continued, coming from the oldest section of the cemetery, where the tombstones were covered in moss and the angel statues seemed to wear tortured expressions. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. When I reached the spot, I saw something that made me freeze. One of the graves was open, the soaked earth scattered around as if it had been hastily dug up. And there, at the bottom of the hole, was a coffin, but it was broken, as if something had clawed its way out from inside. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The flashlight trembled in my hands as I looked around, trying to find some explanation. That's when I heard a laugh, low, raspy, and coming from all around me at once. The flashlight began to flicker, and I saw shadows moving between the tombstones, humanoid shapes, but distorted, as if they were out of focus. They were slowly approaching, and I knew they weren't people, not anymore. I tried to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. The laughter grew louder, sharper, and then I saw what was causing the dragging sound. It was a figure, or what was left of one. Its skin was pale and decayed, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. It dragged a rusty shovel across the ground, and its grin was far too wide for a human face. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered. its voice echoing as if coming from a distant place. "This is my territory." I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. The figure stepped closer, and I felt an intense cold, as if the warmth was being drained from my body. The last thing I saw was the shovel being raised, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying in my cabin, soaked and trembling. The storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to rise on the horizon. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare, until I looked at my hands. They were covered in dirt, and there were scratch marks on my arms, as if I had tried to dig something up. Since that night, I was never the same again. Sometimes I still hear the low laughter and the dragging sound when I'm alone in the cemetery, and whenever I walk past the old section, I feel something watching me, waiting for the right moment to take me back to the hole I never should have left. Story 3. I never believed in ghosts. I was always a skeptic, the kind who laughs at ghost stories and attributes everything to the wind-rattling windows or overactive imaginations. But that was before I took the job as a night watchman at the old Black Hollow Asylum. The place was a shadow of what it once was, a massive decaying building hidden on the outskirts of the small town of Black Hollow in the state of Maine. The asylum was built in the early 20th century and for decades was the site of inhumane treatments and cruel experiments. In 1978, a devastating fire killed more than 100 patients and staff members. Since then, the place has remained abandoned, shrouded in mystery and rumors of paranormal activity. I needed the money. Jobs weren't easy to find in Black Hollow, and the pay was too good to turn down. My job was simple: stay at the site overnight, do rounds every 2 hours, and make sure no one broke into the building. It seemed easy. I was wrong. The first night was quiet. The silence was oppressive, but nothing out of the ordinary. The second night, however, was different. I was in the east wing, making my rounds, when I heard a low, dragging sound, like someone shuffling their feet across the rotting wooden floor. I stopped, shone my flashlight down the hallway, but saw nothing. I figured it was just a rat or the wind rattling a broken window. But then, I heard laughter, low, guttural, as if it were coming from all around me at once. My heart pounded, and I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That's when I saw the shadow. It stood at the end of the hallway, a tall, thin figure with unnaturally long arms hanging at its sides. My flashlight trembled in my hands, but I pointed it toward the shadow. The light passed right through it, as if nothing was there. And then, the figure started moving toward me. It didn't walk. It glided as if floating. I ran. I ran like I had never run before. Back to the security room, where I locked the door and sat on the floor shaking. I spent the rest of the night there, listening to footsteps and laughter just outside the door. The next morning, I almost quit, but the money was good, and I needed it. I decided that if something happened again, I would record it. Maybe that way, I could prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. On the third night, I brought a camera with me. My first round went by without any issues, but on the second, things started to get strange. This time, I was in the West Wing, the place where the fire had started. The air felt heavier there, as if it was charged with something malevolent. That's when I heard the whispers. They came from all directions, indistinct words like multiple people speaking at once. I pointed the camera down the hallway and saw something that made my blood run cold. Several figures, all thin and deformed, stood in the corridor, staring directly at me. Some had burned faces, while others had limbs twisted in impossible ways. I screamed and started running, but the figures followed me. They didn't run, yet they were always there, at every corner, every doorway I passed. When I finally reached the security room, I locked the door and looked at the camera. The footage was there, clear as day. The figures, the burned faces, the empty eyes. The next morning, I showed the footage to my boss. He looked at me with a strange expression and said, "You're not the first to see this, but you were the first to capture it on video." I quit that same day, but to this day, even far from Black Hollow, I still hear the whispers. They follow me no matter where I go. And worse, sometimes in the reflection of a mirror, I see one of those figures standing behind me, smiling.